genetically, it's true. And these data may need increasing or decreasing the actual magnitudes, but they're really built on enormous amounts of DNA information. So this, more than anything, proves that there is a genetic basis. It's rational and understandable why there is irrational behavior in Serbia or in the Middle East or virtually in Northern Ireland or almost anywhere else you go. People are acting in the service of their genes. Next one. Well, I got through that pretty quickly. That's good. That means I can talk a little bit about race differences. And I know this is an old topic, but it's becoming new. It's closing down in one way, and it's really opening up in a major new way. This is Richard Lynn's brand new book. It's, I believe, copies are now on sale here. Race Differences in Intelligence and Evolutionary Perspective. And you don't even have to read the book, although it's a compilation of 500 or 600 published studies now on IQ scores around the world. And the bottom line is in the next slide. This is a world distribution of IQ. And for those of you who can't see the actual chart there, the dark green, which is basically out there in China and Japan, is an IQ of 105. East Asians actually score slightly higher than white people, quite consistently. White people who developed IQ tests in Europe and America standardized IQs with 100. And now it doesn't matter where in the world you go, whether you go out to Australia or South Africa or Western Europe or North America or Argentina, white people behave basically like white people with an IQ of about 100. The biggest surprise of this is that the world average IQ is only about 85. If you look at the brown, or light brown, which is IQ of 85, this is right across all of North Africa, all the way through the Middle East, all Saudi Arabia, out into Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, IQ of 85. All of Latin America, all of the parts of the Caribbean, IQ of 85. And then if you go to Africa, the IQ drops right down to 70. And they're actually now, it's 67 actually, not 70. It's had to be moved down slightly. And there are IQ groups even lower than that. The Australian Aborigines test out with an IQ of 62. And the Kalahari Bushmen, again in Central Africa, apparently check out with an IQ of 56. All the white areas that you see on the chart in Africa and in Siberia and so on is unknown. We just don't have IQ studies from those areas. So this obviously has tremendous implications. It has implications not only for immigration, but it also has tremendous implications for geopolitics. It suggests perhaps that no matter how much you may wish to put a stock exchange or a parliament in somewhere like Baghdad or Nairobi and expect the people there to suddenly start becoming like people in North Dakota, it's just not likely to happen. It may happen in Japan, it may happen in China, it may happen in segments of those groups. There are pockets of areas where there's a higher IQ group. These are averages, perhaps they're low averages, perhaps if we do more and more studies, we'll find that the IQ is much higher. But they're so consistent that it's beginning to look like it's almost impossible to imagine what new evidence would really shift those IQ scores up. In Africa, for example, it really doesn't matter whether you go way back to the 1920s and look at the data then, or in the year 2000 and look at the data published then. It doesn't matter whether you go to East Africa or West Africa or the Congo in the middle, or whether you go right down to South Africa, the IQ is consistently 70. Now, of course, the question then becomes, how much is this genetic? and how much is just due to cultural conditions. We think the bottom line is that it's at least 50% genetic. I can't go into all the arguments for that now, and I say 50% genetic for Africa, for North Africa, and so on, for the Arabs and the Muslim population. 2.2 million people of the world are Muslim with an IQ of 85. So it's not just a big cultural difference, it's also a big IQ difference between Western Europe and the Muslim world. Let's go to the next slide. This is, I'm now going to talk about black-white IQ differences in the United States. And by extrapolation, apply it to the rest of the world. But most of the research over the last 100 years, most of the big issues have concerned why do black people in America, on average, score 15 or more points lower than whites? Is it genetic? Is it environment? And this is a top journal. It's Psychology, Public Policy and Law. It's a law journal, which means that all lawyers who deal with affirmative action kinds of programs read it. It's the only law journal published by the American Psychological Association. And I'm saying all this to try to give a sense of the importance and high top drawer quality of this particular journal. The entire issue of June 2005 was dedicated to an article by Arthur Jensen and me, if we go to the next one, in which we reviewed 30 years of research on race differences ever since Jensen's major piece in 1969 that really shook the world of the egalitarians, and now it's come full circle. And basically what we said was, we concluded that it was the difference between blacks and whites is 80% heritable. We started with a model that says it's 50% genetic, it's 50% environmental. We concluded with the view that it was 80% genetic. And we had very good evidence to go with that particular model. And I'm not going to go through all the technicalities, but what I am going to do is give you some sense of the flavor, because there are 10 technical categories of evidence that we marshaled to show, well, this lines up this way, this lines up this way, this lines up this way, to show that it was genetic. There is, as far as we can see, no cultural comeback. Before I go through the 10 categories, I can tell you that the American Psychological Association took about 2 years or 2.5 years to finally accept our paper and agree to publish it in this journal. But they would only publish it contingent upon finding 4 commentators who would be able to comment and shoot down, presumably, our paper, although they would then give us the right of reply. They were very fair and had the last word, and see if we could reply to whatever the criticisms were. And so the culture-only group came back and did their best, but their best really wasn't good enough. And in fact, it would be a very, very hard thing to shoot it down. Here's the evidence. Let's go to the first slide. First category of evidence, the worldwide IQ distribution. You have to explain why white people in Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and Argentina and America and Canada and England and Scotland all have an IQ of 100, or France or Germany or Russia. Why doesn't it vary around? And furthermore, it stays that way for 100 years. And furthermore, it doesn't matter how you measure it. You can measure it by reaction time measures, culture fair test, this test, that test, the other test. Over 100 years. It's consistent. Same with blacks, same with whites. Same with East Asians, I should say. Next slide. Race differences, that is the magnitude of the black-white difference, are most pronounced on the most G-loaded tests. G being the general factor of intelligence, which is the active ingredient in intelligence tests. It really is the predictive part of a test. And different items of an IQ test load differentially on it. And black-white differences load differentially on it. And the black-white differences